I felt the ground slip away from under my feet when, while browsing through his phone, I came across her name. Simple, unpretentious, Lena. For some reason, I decided to open the message, and after reading a few lines, I realized that this was no longer just a mistake or a coincidence. He knew I was looking through his phone, but I trusted him, as I trusted myself. He had said that all these girls are nonsense, and I believed him. I believed because I wanted to. And now, instead of words, there were numbers, dates, photos, in which I couldn't even recognize my partner. I closed the phone and moved away from him, sitting at the edge of the couch. My mind seemed to turn upside down. In that moment, I felt a heaviness in my chest, like it was hard to breathe. Everything seemed as usual. His jokes, his talks, his images and words. But that was just a shell. And beneath it, emptiness, lies, a ghost of something real that I had created in my mind. He entered the room, but I didn't look up. I was too afraid to see something in his eyes I wouldn't want to see. "Are you okay?" he asked, and I noticed his voice had become slightly colder. I remained silent, and in that silence was everything I had already realized. Everything that now defined the moment. I knew I couldn't continue living like this, but retreating had no meaning anymore. I stood up. Without explanations, without shouting or accusations. I wasn't going to complain. I didn't need his justifications. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" His voice was now tense, even a little frightened. I didn't listen to him. I just walked out. I felt as though only one question remained. Why didn't you do this earlier? But in that moment, I didn't care. I just needed to leave. My mind was swarming with hundreds of thoughts, but one thing was absolutely clear. I would no longer be his victim. I wouldn't allow myself to stay in a relationship where I was simply being used, where I lived in lies. I knew it would be hard ahead, that I would need to gather myself and start from scratch. But one thing was crystal clear. Everything would change from this moment on. I grabbed my backpack, quickly packed my things, pulling out a few more photos from the drawer, where he, as if nothing had happened, was with her. But those photos told me nothing except one thing. If you don't change your life, it will be changed for you. With my things gathered, I turned to the door. My hands were shaking, but my heart was beating steadily. All I had to do was begin. The moment I stepped out the door, there was no fear, no regret. There was only clarity. I wasn't planning on seeking revenge, but I was ready to show him who he really was. It was a moment of complete liberation, and I understood. To leave, I needed to close the door not only behind me, but also on what we had called a relationship. At home, I went straight to the computer. I opened my email and then the documents I had been periodically reviewing. I knew he had been leading a double life, but that he so shamelessly hid everything about her. That became absolutely clear only now. I glanced at the old messages he had sent me. Empty words, promises that I now saw as traps. He was a master manipulator. But I was ready. I started collecting everything. First, the conversations, all the chats with Lena, which had begun long before he started hiding his secret meetings. I could see how he would ask her, "How are you without me?" Or how he promised her that everything would be as it was before. With each new message, the spark of revenge inside me grew brighter. This wasn't just revenge. It was about restoring justice. I wasn't just going to leave. I was going to destroy his world. Every word in these messages was poison he had poured into me. Next were the photos. Images where their faces expressed something that felt alien to me. He laughed in them, and I still couldn't stand to see how warmly he treated a woman who hadn't been part of our world. They looked so close that I began to doubt if I had ever truly meant anything to him. Then came the voice messages. I knew this would be the climax. I listened to them carefully, slowing the playback as though I were hearing his own soul, exposed and vulnerable. His words, his laughter, his intimate confessions. It all sounded foreign to me, like a song I would never want to hear. I didn't feel hurt. I felt confident. Every file was a blow I was ready to strike, but I wasn't in a hurry. Everything had to be perfect. When I finished collecting the materials, I sat at the table and took a deep breath. Now, it wasn't just proof of his guilt. It was a weapon I could use to make his life unbearable. But I wasn't going to act impulsively. I decided that in this very moment, when he would think I was defenseless, I had to strike. I had thought it through to the smallest detail. Every action, every word. When I was ready, I placed my phone down beside me and exhaled. Done. Everything was ready. The holiday was just around the corner, and I already knew exactly how everything would unfold. He was so sure that it would be just another evening dedicated to our new chapter that I could hardly contain a smirk. He had no idea that this wasn't just dinner, but a moment that would enter his life as the most destructive one. And for me, it would be the final chapter of our past. I invited his family. This was no accident. They needed to be here. Everything I was about to reveal was something they needed to hear. After all, they thought of him as perfect. The perfect son, the perfect brother, the perfect friend. But they didn't know that their perfect man was actually a ruthless liar. And the secrets he had been hiding for years were finally going to be exposed. This was the moment they needed to find out who he really was. But I didn't forget about my own loved ones. My friends, those who had stood by me in difficult times, already knew what I had planned. In their eyes, I saw the same determined fire that burned in my own heart. This wasn't just an evening for them. It was an operation, carefully prepared, and I was at the center of it. When he arrived, he was full of enthusiasm, always smiling, talking about how great it was that we had finally overcome all the difficulties. He suspected nothing. I watched him, and in his words, there was not a hint of anxiety, not the slightest unease. In his eyes, there was the image he had created for me, for everyone, the perfect persona he had meticulously crafted. I looked at him with a cold smile. All I needed was time. Time for everyone to gather, for them all to be here, to feel the volatile atmosphere I was creating around myself. The event was arranged so that all the guests, including his family, would be in the right place at the right time. My gaze met his mother's, and I could see how she hoped this evening would bring only joy. But her hopes were empty. I knew that what I was about to say would be as much of a shock to her as it would be to him. When everyone had arrived, when the laughter and chatter began to quiet down, when I could feel the tension in the room rising, I knew. The moment had arrived. All my preparation, all the steps, all the evidence now had to come together into one picture. I looked at him one last time. In his eyes, there was no sign of worry, only carelessness. He had no idea that this evening would not be like all the others. When everyone had taken their places, when the air in the room had thickened with anticipation, I felt my heart start to beat faster. Everything I had prepared was now about to become reality. This was the moment when my whole life, all the lies I had lived, had to fall apart. And I stood on the threshold of that change, with full confidence that I would not back down. He started first, as always. His words sounded confident, with a slight smirk on his lips as he talked about how we had begun a new chapter in our relationship. He spoke of the future, of how we would reach new heights together, of how everything between us before could now be called the past. He looked at everyone with the gaze of a hero in some movie where everyone supports him and admires him. I couldn't listen to it anymore. I couldn't be part of his performance, part of his deception. I stood up. All the gazes that had been focused on him instantly shifted to me. He fell silent. His smile disappeared from his face. I felt the room grow quieter. Everyone had been expecting him to continue speaking, but instead they saw me. I can't be with someone who betrayed me anymore. My words didn't sound like a shout, but like a final decision. With each word, I felt the walls he had built around us begin to crumble. I didn't look at him, didn't search for excuses in his eyes. My words didn't require answers. I had already made my decision long ago. All this time, I've been building my life for us, and he chose a different path. I continued, and now his face was completely colorless, his eyes empty from shock. Shock. It was clear on every guest's face. First his mother, then his sister, and then his friends. They all stood there, not understanding what was happening. Their eyes reflected confusion, disbelief, as if they couldn't believe what I had just said. And he couldn't move. This was his moment, his evening, and now he stood there, overshadowed, not knowing what to do. Everything he had built was falling apart before his eyes. His own words turned into emptiness, and the image he had so carefully constructed was destroyed in an instant. Now everyone looked at him not as a hero, but as a traitor. I paused, giving everyone time to understand what had happened. In that silence, I felt strong. Everything I had endured now seemed worth it, to reveal it all in one moment. I felt the ground beneath my feet become firm. My voice didn't tremble, and my gaze was steady and determined. I was no longer the woman he had tried to control. I was someone else. A woman who had accepted her fate and taken this step to break free from the past. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, and I could no longer hold myself back from acting. The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone was looking at me, then at him, who seemed to suddenly realize that his world had been shattered. He still couldn't believe this was actually happening. But I wasn't going to stop. This was just the first step. I took several steps forward, opening the bag that had long become a symbol of my intentions. "Now," I said, glancing at his family and friends, "you will all see who the person you thought was an ideal really is." I pulled out my phone and, ignoring the terror in his eyes, began showing the very conversations. The moment when I handed the phone to his sister was decisive. She seemed unable to believe what she was seeing. I watched her face change as she flipped through the message threads, realizing that the person in front of her was someone she had never known. The words, his promises, his intimate conversations with Lena, all of it was unfolding before her eyes, and I saw her confidence in his perfection crumble. There was so much disappointment in her eyes that I could feel her support drifting away. It was like a blow she couldn't bear. Her eyes met his, and I saw genuine panic for the first time on his face. This was the moment when his false image ceased to exist for everyone in that room. He might still justify himself to himself, but not to them. His sister passed the phone to her husband, then to their parents. Everyone who looked at the screen saw his face in a new, unclean light. He was no longer the person they knew. Now they saw his true side. I continued. The photos I had found in his old albums where he was with her, just as defenseless as their conversations. He was so close to her. These were images where I saw smiles, his gaze completely absorbed by her. He couldn't hide it. I handed the pictures around the room, and every person who saw them felt how all his truth was laid bare. In that moment, I felt ruthless, but at the same time, liberated. He had prepared his fate, and now he was carrying it, powerless to change anything. The entire room fell into heavy silence. No one knew what to say. He looked at me with hatred but could no longer do anything. His hands trembled. His breath became heavy. He stood there, stunned. At that moment, I stopped and said, "This is just the beginning. If anyone thought he was perfect, I am opening your eyes. And you won't be able to go back to what was." Now his reputation was destroyed. His life, his relationships, everything had been brought into the light. I didn't expect an apology from him, nor did I wait for him to justify himself. I simply showed everyone what he had really been hiding. And in that moment, I felt his world collapsing, his confidence disappearing, the last barrier before his disgrace crumbling. When I finished handing out the conversations and photos, when all eyes were on him, I realized that this wasn't the end. His lies were only one part of what I was about to destroy. I looked at him, and in that moment, everything became clearer than ever. He thought he was hiding his dirty secrets, but I was ready to expose everything. I paused, and everyone in the room waited to see what I would do next. I could feel the tension building. Everything in my life had led me to this point. This moment was the culmination of all the pain I had endured. But what you all probably don't know is how he lived when he wasn't around you. I looked at his mother and sister, who seemed to have just experienced shock. He hid one very important detail from everyone: his relationships with his professors. I saw him pale. He instinctively took a step back, but I couldn't stop anymore. Everything I had gathered had to be revealed. You didn't know that not only did he cheat on me, but he also continued his games at university. All his virtue, which he tried so hard to build, was actually covered in dirt. I paused, watching his terrified face. His affairs with professors, assistants, with anyone, this was all hidden from you. But now you will find out what really happens behind the closed doors of his academic life. I pulled out several documents he didn't know I had found. Screenshots of conversations with his university colleagues, assistants, professors, where their relationships were discussed, where he tried to manipulate his position. I passed them to his mother, then to his sister, and watched their faces change. These weren't just pieces of evidence. This was a world crashing down on him. His academic career, which he loved so much, now hung by a thread. He knew that these documents could destroy his future. You know, it took me a long time to believe this, I continued, my voice now firm. But when you find out that your partner isn't just a liar, but a person who deceives everyone around him, even manipulates at this level, you realize that you can no longer be part of this lie. His mother sat there, pressed into her chair, while his sister was blotched with red as she flipped through the conversations. He stood there, clenching his jaw, but so lost that he didn't know what to say. I could see his world collapsing. Not just as a man, but as a person who had tried to build his career on manipulation and dishonesty. "You think you controlled everything," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "But now you've lost everything. You've destroyed not just me. You've destroyed everything you ever built." This moment was the culmination of everything. He stood before me, weakly trying to justify himself, but already knowing. His career, his reputation, his life. None of it was under his control anymore. I knew that after today, everything would change. I paused, looking at their shocked faces, and in my mind, clarity returned. I had done what I needed to do. The silence in the room had become so thick it felt tangible. Everyone sat there, as if glued to their seats, unable to move. I knew that every word, every piece of evidence I had shown had completely changed the picture. But that wasn't enough. I had to show them once more who he truly was so they could finally see him without filters. So they would understand that everything they knew about him was an illusion. I turned to his family, not taking my eyes off his mother, who sat there with her hands clenched in her lap, her face a mixture of shock and helplessness. "Did you think he was perfect?" I asked calmly, but there was no longer the fragility in my voice that had once been there. "Did you think he was a role model? A wonderful son, a loyal brother? Let me show you who he really is." I paused, watching their reaction. His mother raised her head, almost as if hoping that this was just a nightmare that would end soon. But no. I showed her his conversations with professors, secret exchanges that involved not just academic lies, but personal ones too. I handed her the documents that, without a doubt, would destroy everything he had worked for in his professional life. Confusion appeared in her eyes, but not just because of what she had seen. It seemed she couldn't believe her son could be like this. His sister sat there with wide eyes, and it was clear she didn't know how to react. She sat, unable to tear her gaze away from the phone screen where I kept flipping through messages, photos, showing him in the most unflattering situations. I couldn't let them think this was just a coincidence. This wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was a recurring, systematic deceit, a part of his nature, a part of his life that he had hidden behind a mask of propriety. "Are you wondering why he's always been like this?" I continued, not giving them the chance to restore their sense of order. He always knew you wanted to believe in his ideal, and he used that. He manipulated you just like he manipulated me. Now everyone understood. The person they loved was no longer standing before them. I noticed his mother cover her face with her hands, as if she couldn't bear to look at the son who had now become a stranger to her. She tried to hold back tears, but they inevitably rolled down her cheeks. She clearly hadn't expected her son to be like this. But in this lay his downfall. He had lived in deceit for so long, failing to notice that the idealized image he had created was crumbling like a house of cards. I glanced at his sister. She was silent, but her eyes were filled with anger. She couldn't justify him, despite all her love and affection. She couldn't justify the person she had once looked up to. He sat there, head lowered, as though losing the ability to react. His face was pale, his lips pressed together, but there was no longer any confidence in his eyes, only fear and the realization that no one admired him anymore. "So this is who he is," I said, casting one last look at his family, now with no compassion left. "Now you see his true nature. He was never who he seemed to be." My work was done. I felt his world crumbling, and I didn't care at all. I was no longer the woman who had once been lost in his lies. I was free. And now they, his family, could see his true face. I looked at his mother, his sister, and without saying another word, I turned and left the room. When I left that room, where his family, stunned and disappointed, were processing the revelations about him, I felt the weight I had been carrying finally lift from my shoulders. I was ready. I had done everything that needed to be done. But this was just the beginning. I wasn't going to return to where it all began. He had left me no reason to stay. And now, when his world had collapsed, I couldn't allow myself to get caught in its wreckage. I no longer needed his lies. I couldn't stay part of the false picture he had built. When I returned to him, he was sitting in the corner as though lost in his own thoughts. All his confident words and manipulations had now become nothing but empty shells. I looked at him and felt my feelings for him turning into something cold and foreign. I approached his desk, ignoring his gaze. He didn't even try to justify himself. All those attempts that had once seemed so important to me now felt meaningless. I wasn't going to play his game anymore. I wasn't going to wait for him to betray me again. "I'm not staying in this house," I said, and my words were more decisive than ever before. "I won't wait for you to betray me again. I've already broken this contract, and we need to leave this apartment." He remained silent, and I felt the strength that filled me at that moment. This wasn't just a decision. It was liberation. I felt every step I took distance me from the life I had lived with him. I was no longer his prisoner, and all I needed to do was put an end to it forever. I pulled the keys from my pocket, handed them to him, and saw how he looked at them with utter helplessness. He couldn't believe that everything he had dreamed of for so long had fallen apart. But there was no more room for regrets. There was no room for explanations. "You won't be able to manipulate me anymore," I added, and he finally looked up. His eyes held pain, but it wasn't the pain of my words. It was the pain of realizing I was gone. I was gone for good. "You've lost everything," I finished, and turning, walked toward the door. Each step I took in that moment was like a blow to his world. I didn't regret it. I didn't look back, knowing that this step was the only right one. When I stepped outside, the door slammed behind me, and I felt the heaviness that had hung over me for so long finally disappear. The life I was now building was entirely mine. I wasn't going to let anyone or anything dictate who I was. And with that knowledge, I walked into a new world, free from his shadow. I could no longer stay in that city, in that house, with the memories that still swirled uneasily in my mind. I felt them choking me, pulling me into a void where I could no longer exist. I needed to break free from all of it. I needed to step into a world where I could be myself, where there would be no more of his lies, his manipulations, his trace. At that moment, as I looked at my bag and prepared to gather my last belongings from the apartment, I felt an incredible sense of relief. It was like shedding heavy armor, like stepping out of the shadow where I had hidden for so long. Everything I had been through had become a lesson. I decided I wouldn't dwell on the past anymore. I needed to move forward. I picked up my phone and typed a message. My friend, who had been there with me in those moments when I first began to realize it was all a lie, was already waiting for my call. I'm leaving. I found a job in another city, and I'll be starting with a clean slate. I couldn't help but smile when I sent that message. I didn't need to explain everything that had happened to understand. This step was my path to freedom. I knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be no simple start to a new life. But there was nothing more important than leaving behind everything that had held me back. I stood by the window, watching the first rays of the sun break through the clouds. It was a new day, a new world where I could be myself. My eyes were full of resolve. I could go back. I could allow myself to doubt and be afraid. But I wasn't going to. In that moment, I understood that I was ready to conquer this new path. I walked over to my wardrobe and pulled out a few things. There was no longer any point in keeping the clothes that still reminded me of what I had lost. My hands, as I packed my things, didn't tremble. I was certain that ahead of me lay a world where I could start living again. This was a decision I had made without looking back. I was no longer the woman who had endless conversations about forgiveness. I could no longer justify his mistakes. I couldn't allow myself to be weak again. I was strong, and in this new beginning, I was going to build my life. Before leaving the apartment, I took one last look at these walls, at the world that was no longer mine. And with every step I took down the hallway, I felt myself pulling further away from what had been. I didn't want to be part of his ruined reality anymore. I grabbed my bag, put on my coat, and feeling the cool and fresh air of the hallway, I stepped outside. I didn't look back, because I knew everything that had been between us was now forever in the past. When I left his world, I felt the weight lift, and in its place came confidence. But there was one more thing I couldn't leave unaddressed. I knew that everything that had happened between us would affect him, but I also knew that his lies needed to be exposed not just for those around him, but for those who had seen him as a role model. He had lived in a world where manipulation was the norm, and now, standing on the threshold of a new beginning, I couldn't let that go without consequences. I couldn't leave him indifferent to what he had done, to all the lives he had destroyed. He had believed that he was hidden from everyone, that his lies would remain undiscovered. But I couldn't let him escape responsibility. I couldn't let him walk away without facing the consequences of his actions. I sent everything to the university. The documents, the conversations, the photos, everything he had tried to hide, everything he had thought was beyond reach. I remembered how he had always said his career was untouchable, that his achievements were unquestionable. He was sure that his status would protect him from any consequences, but I knew that if I didn't do this, no one would ever know the truth. A meticulously written report presenting all the evidence of his violations was sent to the dean. I attached all the documents and emails confirming his actions. I wrote that this wasn't just personal revenge, but a necessity for the preservation of integrity and justice. His behavior at the university should not go unnoticed. He needed to be held accountable for his actions. When I pressed send, I felt the tension begin to release. It was the final step, the last moment when I could sever him from my life. I knew that with this report, his career could be ruined, that everything he had worked for could be destroyed. But it was necessary. For me, for everyone who had ever suffered from his lies and manipulations. After the email was sent, I closed my computer and looked around the space where I was now. It was all behind me. I had made my choice. I had done my part. Now, knowing that he would no longer be able to continue his life in the shadows, I could move forward in peace. I was no longer part of his world. I stood up, feeling my strength returning. I looked around and took another step toward my new life. This step was confident and firm. I felt no pity, no regrets, no fear. All that remained was my freedom. Now, with my journey complete, I knew I had done the right thing. Everything that was behind me had only been a lesson, and ahead of me lay a new world. The moment I completed the last step, sending the report and closing this chapter of my life, I felt completely indifferent to everything that was left behind. I no longer looked back, didn't glance over my shoulder, didn't return to those moments when I could have regretted, when I doubted. I felt something inside me completely shift. It wasn't just liberation. It was the moment when I fully stopped being a part of his life, a part of his broken world. I no longer lived for him. I lived for myself. In the second I left everything behind, when I left that city, that apartment, I felt all the weight leave me. There was no regret, no resentment. Everything I needed to do, I had already done. The look in the mirror reflected who I truly was. I felt every cell of my body filling with strength, and despite the fact that I couldn't forget what I had endured, I was already ready to move forward. I was now free. I felt it not as an act of revenge, but as an act of self-liberation. Breaking old ties, tearing apart those chains, it wasn't just a farewell to him. It was a farewell to my own fears, to the version of me I thought I should be. I wasn't a victim, nor a heroine. I was a woman who had learned to be strong no matter what had happened. My life was now in my hands, and I was ready to rebuild it. Standing outside, I breathed in the fresh air. It was different, unlike the air I had breathed before. Everything I had endured had now become a part of me, but I no longer allowed it to control my future. My gaze was forward. I didn't look back. I knew it wouldn't be easy. I understood that a long road lay ahead. But this road I was walking with the full awareness that I no longer lived in the past. I had begun a new chapter, and this was only the beginning. I got into the taxi, which was taking me to a new city, to a new life. Through the window, I watched the streets pass by, familiar yet so foreign. And I understood, at that moment, as I left his world behind, I was becoming the person who would never again allow herself to be betrayed. This was the end of the old story. But for me, this was the real new start. And I felt my strength returning with every kilometer I traveled, becoming more confident in my decision.